Well, welcome everyone. My name is Nathan Auberg, and I am a Prairie Crossing resident and a staff member with the Liberty Prairie Foundation. Thank you for getting on another Zoom call in your life. I hope this is a positive experience for you in that way. Um, we are still having some people logging on. Right now, we've got about 18 people, which is awesome. Um, Today, we're going to be hearing from Daniel Suarez, the Stewardship Program Manager with Audubon Great Lakes. He's going to be sharing some really cool information about birds, bird life, and also helping us understand what we can do in our own yards to help birds, both migratory and resident birds, kind of have a better life. This is, by the way, an event we're organizing for the Prairie Crossing Homeowner Association. I want to give a shout out to them. And since we don't these days, because of COVID and Zoom and everything else in the winter, we don't have a chance to actually interact with each other very much. I'm hoping that you will not mind if I ask each household to share your names, your favorite bird, and in one brief sentence, your sort of one nature experience you've had in Prairie Crossing that was especially meaningful. And I'll be just calling people out as I go through this. I'll start myself again, Nathan Auberg, with my wife Mayumi and Owen, who will be joining us shortly. Favorite bird is a Cedar Wax Wing, and our favorite nature experience, we had 3 different flocks of Cedar Waxwings in 3 different trees in our neighborhood, all coming to our juniper tree on one day to get berries. It was like an air traffic control situation, so it was really cool. So I'm just going to go down the list of people we have on the call. I see, is it Dennis Hank, or yes, is it Hank Dennis?
Yeah, Hank Dennis. Thanks, Nate. I'm here with my wife, Stephanie, and we love cardinals because they represent the recently departed who is visiting you. And we have seen hawks land on our tree, and it's fun to watch because of the voracious raptor nature of the creature. So they're if you watch them long enough, you'll see something.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next, I'm going to go with you're showing up as mom and dad's iPhone.
Wait. Hi, sorry about that. It's Mary Walsh. My husband's here, Chris. And
Great.
My favorite bird is the green heron. And one of my best experiences here in Prairie Crossing is just walking through the trails and watching the sandhill cranes come in and land in the prairie. I just love it. It's so cool. They look like a helicopter dropping their legs, and it's the best. So thank you for hosting.
Sure, thank you. Then we have Mark and Bonnie Lovejeff.
Yeah, hi. Mark and Bonnie Lovejeff. I see a few familiar faces here. We work with the Environmental Stewardship Group on a regular basis. I would say my favorite bird, only because he's a regular frequent visitor almost every day, is a red-bellied woodpecker.
Nice.
He's the big one. He's about 9 inches almost, and he's here just about every day.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to move next to Linda Wiens.
Hi, I am Linda Wiens. My favorite bird is the flicker, which lands right just sort of outside my window quite often and pecks for the suet, and it's so pretty. And my most interesting experience was earlier this summer when one day I just looked out just beyond my computer in the backyard, and there was a red-tailed hawk, and he just caught a big bird and he was eating it, and I just watched him the whole time. And it was scary, and I was sad for the other bird, but then again, the hawk needed something to eat too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Linda. Suzanne Cash.
Hi, Suzanne Cash. And well, I like them all, but I'm going to pick a chickadee because we just moved in, and what usually happens is if I put up a bird feeder, the birds are not used to it. They don't know what it is, but the chickadees are always the first to come and give it a try, and very quickly. I think they're really super bold and spunky.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I have Steve Sennett. Oh, you got you're muted there, Steve.
All right, here we go. I'm Steve. You see Ann and I are on Calamus Lane. And I'd say our favorite bird is the house wren. They've been nesting in a house off our deck for several years. And my most memorable situation in Prairie Crossing was several years ago on Harris Road, where I witnessed 2 red-tailed hawks had trapped a squirrel on a tree limb. And they just pestered that poor squirrel, who swirled around the tree trying to evade them, and finally made a run for it and lost. And the red-tailed hawks feasted on the upper limbs of that tree. It was unforgettable.
Wow, awesome. Next, we'll go to Robert Lossman. I think you are muted as well.
Hi, I'm Bob Lossman. I live on Prairie Trail. I teach at College of Lake County with all those sustainability people. I keep trying to track birds except for the woodpeckers, which I'm going to send over to Mark's house because they keep trying to peck holes in my siding. But other than that, I like them just fine. The sandhill cranes, I saw a whole bunch of them flying over in a flock over the house. So that was pretty cool. And behind all the cul-de-sacs, there's some bluebirds that are just, there was a whole lot of them back off one of the trails. So that was kind of cool. So
awesome. All right, next we have, it shows up as Joey Feinstein.
Yes, I'm Han, and Joey's over yonder, and Moe is, maybe I'll see if he can come over, but we just moved to Prairie Crossing, and Dave is actually our neighbor across the alley, so it's fun to see you, Dave. Our favorite bird, Moe, what's our favorite bird? Woodpecker. He just said woodpecker. And I think our favorite nature memory thus far in our experience is sliding down the big hill behind the farm.
Awesome. So
Nice
glad to have you both join, your whole family join. Welcome to Prairie Crossing.
Sure thing.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Sandy, you're next. Sandy, so glad to see you out of the hospital. Welcome back. You are muted, by the way. You're muted. Let's see, bottom left of your screen, there's a little microphone. There you go.
Duh, sorry. I'm Sandy Morris. I live on Goldenrod Lane, and my favorite bird is the chickadee. They're just so perky and cute, and they are very friendly, and they've been mad at me because I've been away from home and I haven't been putting out my usual seed. And I went to put out some seed today, and several of them immediately came into the tree and were scolding me. So that made me very happy. My favorite experience here has been encounters with coyotes on the trails. And some of those encounters have been very close. So that's always a thrill for me. I'm never scared of them. And it's just, anyway, that's my favorite.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandy. Jim O'Connor.
Yes. I guess I should tell you that that thing over my head is not a halo. Some of you maybe figured that out already.
Many years ago.
Because this is a family thing, I'm not going to talk about the 2 great horned owls up on the chimney the other night. Instead, I'm going to mention the hummingbirds that love to land on our royal catch fly. So if you want to attract hummingbirds plant some royal catchfly in your prairie. They'll be there July and August to entertain you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Next, we have Lou. Lou, you were also muted.
Yeah, it's Lou Gebler. I'm over on Hedgerow. I think my favorite bird that I've seen so far is a woodcock. We're driving down Harris one day, and I thought there was something in the road that looked like a bird that was injured, but he was actually just dancing back and forth. I'd never seen that before. So that's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Christian Hicks.
Actually, I'm Kathy.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. It's my husband's computer. He's around, but he's been on Zoom all day for work, so he said he didn't want to do this. And my daughter Nora's over at the table listening, maybe. We live on Wild Iris, and my favorite bird would be a chickadee. Also, we have one. My husband got me this clear feeder that suction cups on our window, and the chickadees are the only things that come to that. So they're pretty brave and entertaining. And my favorite experience so far has been when I was at my community garden plot. There were 2 sandhill cranes that were kind of circling above and just rising on the thermals. They were pretty high up, but they were low enough that I could still hear them, and it was pretty cool. So there's so many things, but that was my favorite so far.
That's awesome. Thank you. Karen Wissiel.
Hi. My favorite bird, I was going to say red-tailed hawk. That seems to be everybody's favorite. And I think I share with Sandy the having seen the coyotes out in the horse pasture hunting as a pair, and they kind of go in parallel lines, widely separated from each other, but they're a pair. And I wished them luck. I didn't see them catch anything.
Excellent. Wendy Holloman.
We live on Hedgerow, the south side of Hedgerow. I enjoy watching them all. Flocks of sparrows come to the bush outside the window. I love watching them. I don't care what they are. There's a hawk that we had a tree. Our neighbor had a dead tree, and this hawk would perch in there forever. Eventually, they took the tree down. So now it comes in the next yard. There's a tree there. So I love watching the hawk, and always here and hunting in the yard behind us. So that's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Dave Carpenter.
Hi, I live on Porter Road, across from Han and Joey and Moe. Hi, Moe. And I would say my favorite bird is a bird I have never seen. Can I do that? I'm dying to see a snowy owl. My wife has seen one over by the out parcel there, but at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I may not see that one. But other than that, I would have said Cedar Wax Wing because we like those. Favorite nature experience was probably about 18 years ago. I saw a family of foxes over by the 45 underpass. Haven't seen one since, but that was spectacular. And I thought, wow, this is a really great place to live. And I still feel that way.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Shelly.
Hello, I am Shelly Mann. I live over on Osage Orange, and I can't say I really have a favorite bird. I like any of the larger birds that come to Sanctuary Pond behind us. So the pond, whether it's an egret or a great blue heron. Maybe the nature story that I know recently is year after year I've had mourning doves, which I know are probably not anybody's favorite bird, but I've had mourning doves nest on a basket that I have on my front porch. And it seems very routine that they said that they come back year after year. One year I actually had a a mom raised 3 broeds in 1 year. She just
Wow.
like 2 weeks later, she'd come back, lay 2 more eggs. Then the kids would grow up and leave. Then 2 weeks later, she'd come back and lay more eggs. So I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Maybe the mothers know that you're a pediatrician and they figure you can jump in and help
They know
out.
I would not harm them. That's right.
Excellent. Thank you. Jill.
Hi, I'm Jill Wallace. I live on Prairie Trail across the street from Sandy. And it's hard to pick a favorite bird, maybe the eastern bluebirds. And I've never seen one until I moved to Prairie Crossing, and I always treasure getting a glimpse of those. And maybe one of my favorite nature experiences has probably been, one of them at least, is monitoring the nest boxes. It's just so interesting to see the birds, the beautiful little nests they build in the nest boxes, and then seeing the tiny little pink helpless babies that can't even lift their heads, and then seeing them develop and be ready to fly away within a few weeks. It's always really fun to watch.
And Ted, we're just having people share their favorite bird and favorite nature experience here in Prairie Crossing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ted Ersky. I live over by the beach. And our favorite bird is probably one of the woodpecker varieties, just simply because of the colors. My favorite nature experience at Prairie Crossing is simply walking the trails. I'm on them all the time, especially when it's sunny and beautiful, and it just is constantly inspiring. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining in and kind of saying hi to each other. It's really nice to see people's full faces and hear some great stories. Of course, it's not an accident that being in Prairie Crossing, we have these experiences and see these amazing birds. It was designed to sort of be different than every subdivision. And in fact, the #1 guiding principle of the 10 guiding principles that the developers of Prairie Crossing put together was environmental protection and enhancement. And Prairie Crossing does that a number of different ways. Originally, Prairie Crossing, the area that's now Prairie Crossing, was going to be developed with over 1,000 homes. The people who bought Prairie Crossing eventually through a settlement decided we need to do something different. A significant amount of land here is protected by a conservation easement. We're actually in the middle of the Liberty Prairie Reserve, which has about 6,000 acres, of which about 3,000 is preserved. So we benefit from all this protected space that attracts a lot of great birds. And then, of course, the design of Prairie Crossing itself incorporates a lot of open space, a very strategic placement of homes, and obviously the ongoing stewardship with prairie burns and volunteers. So it's a very special place to be. So we're really excited to hear from Daniel today. One of the things I want to just say before we get rolling is #1, thank you to Sandy and Jill. Sandy and Jill kind of helped think through and research some different speakers, and really, we're really interested in making this event happen. Thank you to both of you. I also want to encourage you, once Daniel starts his presentation, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself and also stopping your video. That'll reduce the amount of bandwidth that's being consumed, so we can definitely see Daniel's presentation, hopefully in full force. And then we're going to have 3 opportunities to ask questions. We'll take, Daniel's going to stop twice during the presentation, and you can ask your questions through the chat, and I'll look at the chat and ask him the questions. And then at the end of the presentation, everyone can share their screen again, and you can ask your question through the chat, or you can actually just speak it. So without further ado, I want to let Daniel go ahead. Daniel, we're so excited to have you. It's been great. Thank you for coming out to Prairie Crossing in advance to kind of scout out the territory. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Nathan. Glad to be here. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you about the 2 great loves in my life, birds and native plants. So I'll just jump right into this presentation because I have quite a bit of content to go through. Okay. And I assume the screen is being shared. Nathan, everything looks okay?
Everything looks great.
Perfect. Well, as Nathan mentioned, I work for Audubon Great Lakes, which is a regional office of the National Audubon Society, which many of you are probably aware of. It's one of the oldest conservation organizations in the United States, and one whose sole mission is to conserve the birds that call the Western Hemisphere home for generations to come. And I don't think you can really talk about birds and about native plants without just reveling in the glory of birds, the majesty, the mystery of how these creatures find their way into our backyards and across the Western Hemisphere on an annual basis. So what you're seeing here is a graphic that's pulled from Audubon, and it's kind of showing the different classes of birds: shorebirds, landbirds, seabirds, raptors, and waterfowl. Certainly not every species, but you can kind of see the multiple ways that these birds are migrating from North America to South America through Central America and vice versa. I think an important question that we all ask ourselves is, why do birds migrate? And I could probably spend a full hour and a half talking to you about the different theories, evolutionary theories on why birds have migrated and why other animals migrate. But in short, I will say this as I pull up a different graphic, and this graphic shows you, and I hope there's not too much lag as it's showing on your screens. This is an animation created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology that looked at 118 species of birds that migrate through North America. And what I want you to pay attention to is how, as these dates progress, just how much of a congregation of different species you see just around the southern tip of Lake Michigan. So a lot of people don't recognize that in the Chicago area, we are very fortunate to be on one of the most active migratory pathways in the United States. These are ancient migration routes that have been undertaken by birds for centuries and millennia. And whether the conditions are there for the birds to thrive or not, they will continue migrating through this path. So it's really important for us as a culture, really, to embrace this and to find ways to sustain and nurture life. So when we talk about migration, it's important to recognize just how risky it is. It's a very dangerous endeavor, and a lot of these birds take this on every single year. Now, certainly we have resident birds that might be here year-round, or they might migrate just to the southern United States, but some of these species are crossing oceans, are crossing whole continents to get home, either to their breeding grounds or to their wintering grounds. And in the Chicago area, while we do have, more than a lot of other metropolitan areas, a plethora of open space, there are certainly many, many risks to undertaking this migration. And migration is actually the time of the year where birds see the most mortality. It's the most dangerous period of the year for birds to exist. And as they enter the Chicago area, whether it's through downtown Chicago, and you could see here, I specifically chose a photo of Chicago at nighttime because a lot of these birds are actually migrating at night. They're following, there's some debate as to how these birds that have never traveled to their wintering grounds, that are born in the Chicago area, how they're able to find those wintering grounds while never being there before. These birds are migrating at nighttime. And so when they arrive in the Chicago area at nighttime, you can think of it this way. They follow rivers, they're following bodies of water. The Great Lakes are a huge magnet for a lot of these migratory birds. And as they're traveling at nighttime, as dawn approaches, they're immediately vulnerable to predators. And so after a long, full night's flight, they try to find the first available patch of habitat that is nearby. And if you happen to be a bird in downtown Chicago, that's obviously going to be much harder for you to survive. The bright lights of the downtown area disorient birds. They create reflections on the glass buildings that disorient them and actually are perceived as birds to be a continuation of space. And so what we find in the Chicago area, I didn't want to harp on the doom and gloom so much and show you pictures of dead birds, but the Chicago area is one of the is one of the focal sites for the Lights Out program, which is an amazing program that works with building managers in a lot of the United States' major cities to either turn the lights off, to draw the blinds within certain parts of the building at nighttime to reduce that reflection and the glare that the glass causes that disorients the birds. But unfortunately, in Chicago, not every single building abides by the guidelines, and there is significant mortality in downtown Chicago in spring and summer migration. It's really sad. I work not too far from this picture, and it's a little sad to see beautiful, bright colored birds who have made it all the way from Nicaragua or Panama and only to meet their end in downtown Chicago. Now, similarly, the suburban areas of the region are a bit more hospitable. We don't have quite as many issues with skyscrapers and light pollution, but without adequate sources of food for birds, places to rest, water, the basic things that all living things need, it can be also a trap, an ecological trap. So these birds all undertake an amazing migration every single year. Some are coming, like I mentioned, for only a few hundred miles away. Others are undertaking a really Herculean effort to get to the United States, to get to the Chicago area, either to breed here or to continue moving north to their breeding grounds in the Arctic or in the boreal forest. And so I'm going to call out a couple of different birds. Just U.S. prairie crossing residents, I think, are much more well equipped than some of the other audiences I've given this talk to know some of these birds and to maybe have seen these in your yard. But I want to hone in on a couple of key species just to kind of illustrate the staggering diversity of the birds that we get in the Chicago area. And I didn't really speak too much about myself, but I'll just say briefly that I have an art history degree from college and only came into conservation afterwards out of necessity, I guess you could say, after not being able to find gainful employment in the field. And so I wouldn't really call myself, I don't think I would consider myself having grown up as this like nature kid or even getting out into preserves very much. So when I started really learning about plants and then eventually birds, I was totally awestruck by the diversity that was under my nose the whole time. And birds that had been flying around my neighborhood my entire life were things I had never seen. And so I always love to start with the Scarlet Tanager, because one of my ecological mentors told me about a trip that he took in the Amazon rainforest. And he asked his guide while they were in a canoe going down the river, what the most beautiful bird in the Amazon was. And this guide explained this bird. He had a particular name in Portuguese that he called this bird. But after about half an hour, they came upon this patch of the forest, and he heard the bird calling out, and he directed he directed my mentor to look up into the canopy to look for a bright red color. And my mentor was shocked to find that the bird that he was directing him towards was the Scarlet Tanager. This is a bird that nested in the forest preserve that this man was stewarding. And here he was halfway across the world. And the most beautiful bird from this man's perspective, a lifelong resident of the Amazon, was a bird that actually flies through Chicago every single year. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really powerful. And similarly, on another part of the color spectrum, we have the Indigo Bunting. Just a striking blue bird. One of the rarest colors that you see in nature is the color blue, and its unmistakable song in the spring tells me that it's always there. The Indigo Buntings are always migrating through, and they're usually easier heard than seen. The common Nighthawk is one of my favorites. This is an aerial insectivore. It's one of the nightjars. They're really peculiar birds. This bird is similarly migrating into South and Central America every year. And it calls the Chicago area home. And this is actually one of our breeding birds. This isn't one that just simply moves through. Scarlet Tanager has nested, can nest in some preserves around the region. same for the Indigo Bunting, but by and large, they're nesting a little bit further north of us. The common nighthawk is smack dab in the Chicago area. I live in Chicago, and on a summer's night, the calls from common nighthawks are unmistakable. These are species that really take advantage of flat roofs. So apartment buildings, commercial spaces, offices, anything with a flat roof, common nighthawks are possible residents. And I'm a big baseball fan, and anytime I've been to a night game at Wrigley Field over the last few years, once I knew what to look for, I always see common nighthawks in the lights during a night game. The Kestrel is another one. This bird, actually, there's so many. This is a representation of a bird that we know very little about its migration. Believe it or not, in the year 2021, there are still ecological mysteries that evade scientists and researchers. And every year we learn a little bit more. The tracking devices are getting smaller and more inexpensive and more accurate, and it's easier to understand where these birds go. But because migration is the riskiest time of the year for a bird, it's usually, the more we can learn about where it's going and for how long, the more we can do to try to work with people in the places where they spend their winters to make sure that they have everything that they need, to make sure that routes that we can minimize the number of dangers. The Cedar Wax Wing, one that was very popular with all of you in your opening remarks, also one of my favorites, just really one of the more beautiful birds in North America. Another one that I'd probably heard a million times before I ever really saw one, before I could really appreciate it. But just the stunning beauty of these birds, and you can see a small little berry in one of those birds' mouths, and if you've ever had the joy of being able to witness the Cedar Wax Wings in their courtship rituals where they pass a berry back and forth to one another. It's really something amazing to see. And I could not talk about about migratory species without mentioning warblers. And warblers are, I think, really the most iconic migratory bird species because they really capture the imagination with the fiery colors, the beautiful songs, and just knowing that these birds, which some of them weigh less than a nickel, are actually flying 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles every single season, twice a year, to get to and from its breeding grounds. A lot of these birds call the boreal forest home in Canada, but some of them do breed in the Chicago region. The one in the middle on the bottom, the yellow warbler there, tied up on the balancing on the grapevine, is a local resident. The staggering diversity of warblers is something that I think for new people to birding is something that people can't really register. But the reason why, someone like myself who had probably never seen a warbler until my mid-20s, you have to know where to look for them, and you have to know what they require to attract them to your yard. So growing up in Chicago, I didn't really have much compatible habitat. My dad, to my horror, once I started gaining my ecological education, was an avid planter of purple loosestrife in his yard, and that's not a very welcoming plant to a migratory species that's looking for food. So the warblers, everything that I'm going to be talking about today in terms of what you can do in your yard applies to warblers. If you want to see warblers, if you haven't seen many at Prairie Crossing, there's definitely things you can do to try to attract these birds to your property. Another bird that I heard a lot of people mentioning was the ruby-throated hummingbird, or hummingbirds in general. And I wanted to just give you a sense as to how these populations of birds are actually migrating through the area. So these are these amazing new maps that have been produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is one of the preeminent research institutions in the world that looks at birds. And this data is all provided through eBird. And eBird, I'll mention it a little bit later, but eBird is a smartphone app, also a website that people can log their bird observations on in a very methodical, simple to use way. And it's if not the largest, one of the largest data sets of community scientists in the world. And we call them community scientists or citizen scientists because it's everyday people that are collecting this data. But when you're able to empower people to capture observations, pretty soon you have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of records. And so you can track how these birds are moving across the landscape season by season. So I'll run that animation one more time, and you can kind of see, starts out in southern Mexico and Central America, and by May and June has migrated through into the Chicago area. This bird is one of the species that I mentioned. A huge portion of its population actually migrates from South America directly over the Gulf of Mexico on a non-stop flight that takes anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. And this is a bird that fits in the palm of your hand, that weighs as much as a penny or a nickel, and it somehow survives that journey across the Gulf of Mexico every single year. Something really amazing and beautiful, I think, in that. Another species, just to kind of show you another kind of migrant, this is one that overwinters in the United States and Cuba. And this one is, when I mentioned the boreal forest and the Arctic Circle, this species, the palm warbler, really nests much further north of Chicago. But as you can see, as I run this animation one more time, a huge portion of its population passes through the Chicago region. That dark blue color shows you just how much we get. And sure enough, come May, when I'm out birding, palm warblers are one of the most common birds that you encounter on a good day for warblers. Now, these birds, as you can imagine, their wintering grounds and their breeding grounds can look a lot different. So if you take a bird, a common eastern forest bird, for, like, let's say the wood thrush, for instance, in the winter, they're in Central America in these lush tropical rainforests like you see on the bottom picture. And when they come up to the United States, they're exploiting the eastern forests, either these oak hickory forests or these maple beech forests. And really, you go from these unbroken landscapes of millions of acres of forest, and when they arrive in the United States, if they're a breeding species, they're confined to a small area like you see here, which isn't necessarily not as ecologically sound as prairie crossing, but similar issues of fragmentation. And so the threats that these birds face are much larger. Their competition for resources is much greater, and it's hard to imagine a bird species that could go from living in the rainforest to living in a small 10-acre woodlot in the United States. It really blows the mind. So I just mentioned the wood thrush, and I'm sure a lot of you people have heard, and again, I won't dwell on the doom and gloom because this is all about getting you excited about planting native plants, about welcoming more birds to your yard. But it's important to know kinds of the what we're up against here. And it's what really a wholesale loss of birds in the past 50 years. I don't know if anyone paid attention or heard about the recent study that came out that said that compared to just a couple of decades ago, we've lost over 3 billion birds in North America, which is a staggering number. And 41% of all neotropical migratory songbirds are also declining. And you can see here on the chart, the wood thrush numbers have gone down precipitously. Beautiful warbler like cerulean warbler has seen even steeper declines, 74% decline. And on an annual basis, that's roughly about 3% loss per year. So if you can imagine 3% of its total population being lost every year puts you on a fast track towards extirpation, which is a localized extinction, or unfortunately for some species, extinction. The yellow-billed cuckoo, very elusive bird in our area here, the rainbird, as many people know it as, over 50% decline. And the rose-breasted grosbeak, 35% decline. And we know the reasons why this has happened. And I'm going to go through a series of 4 slides here that will illustrate just how much denser our populations have gotten across the United States. And you can pay attention to the Chicago region. I'm sure you all know this is going to go from 1940 to 1980 to 2010 to 2030, just a few, less than a decade away. We've lost huge amounts of land, and anytime you're talking about the wholesale shift in landscape and the conditions on the landscape for birds, you can see just how much more of a challenge birds will be facing in the coming years. We've gone from a contiguous landscape of a huge diversity of native plants, and what we've done is developed over 50% of the United States in this suburban-urban matrix. And in this matrix, we know that about 80% of plants, give or take, are non-native. And in some areas, like I would say the Chicago area, that number is probably much greater than 80%. And why is that important? Why is it important that these species, these native plants, or these non-native plants and these birds that are migrating through, what's the disconnect there? And why are native plants better for birds? And so I'm here to talk about a little bit about just the general thinking on how native plants can create a brighter future for birds, but also to give you some solid information about what you can do at Prairie Crossing to make it even a stronger place for birds. So when we talk about food groups for birds, and after this slide, Nathan, just so you know, if we want to take a little break for questions, I'll just set this slide up. And the next section, we're going to talk about 4 native plant food groups for birds that are key, and all the native plants will fall into these 4 categories. So native plants provide berries and fruits, they provide nectar, and they provide nuts and seeds. And I'll go through each of those, and as just kind of like a thought-provoking question, we'll leave that 4th one until I pick up the slides, or if folks would like to guess what that 4th category of food groups are for birds, you can take a swing. So Nathan, I think I saw the chat starting to light up, so I don't know if we want to take some questions here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. At this point, I would welcome questions in the chat. Most of the chat buzz has been about, we have someone who's not seeing all of your slides, but everyone else seems to be. So I hope they'll be able to figure that out. Does anyone have any other questions to Daniel right now about bird migration, things that he's talked about? Any questions? Otherwise, we can just let him keep moving along. And you can use the chat. So here we have one. What birds have been appearing in greater numbers here as a result of climate change? That's interesting.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's one that we're starting to gain a stronger appreciation for. And I would say that with climate change, we're not necessarily seeing different birds during migration. What we're seeing are different birds during the winter time. So I think for most people, American robins used to be the harbinger of spring. The song of a robin was the telltale sign that spring is just around the corner. And now robins are year-round residents. I see them in the winter time. I see them in the fall. I see them in the spring. I see them in the summer. Similarly, other species, and some you might find intriguing, eastern bluebirds are starting, a lot of people predict that in just a couple of decades, if not earlier, eastern bluebirds will become year-round residents in much of the United States and much of the northern United States. This is indicative of how, in climate terms in the Chicago regions, we're obviously slated to get hotter winters and longer periods of drought and stronger storms in the spring and more rain. Another thing we're seeing is really increased temperatures in the wintertime. And so that's giving birds more of a chance to actually carve out a living here over those harsh winter months. Another bird that might be not a common resident at Prairie Crossing, maybe I'm wrong, is the eastern meadowlark. And the eastern meadowlark is another species that was a migratory species that would go down to the southern United States, the southeast, and now is in places as close as southern Illinois. We're starting to see eastern meadowlarks stay over the winter months as well.
Great question. Thank you. Great information. We have a question from Stephen Ann. In the suburbs, are bright outdoor yard lights attracting migratory birds with similar bad outcomes as in the cities?
I don't believe so. When we talk about these, these downtown areas with these bright lights, it's really the when you add all of those lights together, that's what really makes the big impact. The fact that downtown Chicago is also right on the lakefront is another reason why it's particularly devastating. These migratory birds, they follow courses of water. They follow the shores of Lake Michigan. A lot of birds migrate along the western shore of Lake Michigan. And so a city that is situated more, in a landlocked situation, not near any major rivers or bodies of water, probably don't have as much of an impact. But in the suburbs, certainly there's light pollution, but it's not having the same disorienting effect as downtown area, or as something like the one thing that comes up all the time is the 9/11 memorial in New York City, and Audubon and other groups have worked with New York City to try to get those lights periodically turned off, because what you'll find is that birds will be attracted to that beam of light, and they'll actually fly in circles nonstop all night in that light beam, and witnesses have seen dead birds falling out of the sky in that area because they get so disoriented, they get caught up in this light, they fly around it, and probably because it's attracting insects and it's too much, and they drop right out of the sky. So and also, yeah, like Robert says in the chat, reflective glass amplifies that light pollution as well. So in suburbia, you're not dealing with that quite as much. There, the issue is more of just having the right types of food available for birds.
Excellent. Since I'm not seeing any other questions, I think why don't we just, I think we're gonna have a lot more questions around plants and yards and how we can improve things. So why don't you get back on? And again, if I can ask everyone to mute both your video and your audio, I think that's gonna help this be as great an experience as possible. Thanks a lot.
All right, let me just find my slide I left off on. Okay. So the big reveal, the fourth native plant food group for birds is, well, we've got our berries, our nuts, our nectar, insects, specifically caterpillars. So something that for, I think, a lot of folks, myself included, when I first learned about this, I was shocked to learn that 96% of land birds feed insects to their chicks, almost exclusively to their chicks, 96% of all species. So for a young bird, caterpillars are the predominant food in your diet. So really, if you want to make your yard bird friendly, you have to find ways to attract caterpillars. And for some audiences, that's a daunting proposition. A lot of folks don't like to see insects, but I assure you, these insects, these caterpillars are there. They've been living under your nose this whole time. And by welcoming more into your yard, you're not risking their infiltration into your house. So I just want to talk a little bit about caterpillars for a second. And a lot of what I'm talking about is really eloquently and beautifully stated in the book Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy. This really is one of the Bibles for native plant gardeners in the United States. I'm sure many of you have heard of this book, and if you haven't, I would highly recommend you to check it out at your library or purchase it online. One of the main takeaways of this book is showing the stark contrast between native species and non-native species through the lens of how many caterpillars they can sustain. So when we look on the left, we have an oak tree. This is a white oak, and the white oaks are host to staggering diversity of caterpillars. 557 species of caterpillars have been recorded using oaks as a primary plant, as a host plant. And these are caterpillars of butterflies and moths. Meanwhile, a non-native species that is heavily marketed as pest-free, like the ginkgo, only sustains 5 species of caterpillars. So if you're talking about native plants and birds, obviously oaks and other native species are going to be able to provide much more food to a bird that is eagerly looking for food to feed its young. And with insects, specialization is key. Insects are the product of millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, and 90% of the insects that eat plants can only eat the native plants with which they've co-evolved. They've developed some very amazing interactions and symbiotic relationships, and the birds really take advantage of that. And I think one of the iconic caterpillars in our region here is a good illustration of not only the dangers of that birds face, but the dangers that migratory species in general face. So we know that the monarch butterfly goes from this caterpillar to these amazing butterflies that all migrate to the same small patch of land in Mexico every single year for eons. And those numbers are quickly declining because of the many dangers that butterflies face, similar to what birds face, except for the monarch, it's been the wholesale elimination of roadside flowers, specifically milkweed, and the conversion of agriculture to intensive industrial agriculture that prioritizes planting crops all the way to the edge, eliminating any weeds nearby. Locally, we have some really amazing caterpillar and native plant interactions. So I'd like to introduce you to the spicebush swallowtail. I'm sure many of you have seen this butterfly before, but I bet not many have seen the caterpillar. And this caterpillar, as you can see, this cartoonish look to it is a defense mechanism. So as just like any other species that you might that might have eyes in the back of its head, an animal is less likely to strike where the eyes are, thereby preserving the most vital parts of the caterpillar if it does get attacked by a bird or some other animal. And this species has a really unique interaction with the spice bush, which is a native shrub, and whose berries there in red are some of the most nutrient-rich food sources that a migratory bird could hope for. Another type of swallowtail is the giant swallowtail. This species has a relationship with wafer ash, and I did mention it before. Spicebush is the only plant that these caterpillars will lay their eggs on. And in this case, the giant swallowtail, the only species that it will lay its eggs on is the wafer ash. And as its caterpillar, as the eggs hatch and as the larvae start eating, the leaves of their host plants are their first meal. And this swallowtail caterpillar that you see here, the disguise that it uses, the camouflage that it uses, is trying to be unassuming and look like a piece of bird poop. So that is really evolution at its finest. Something as mundane as bird poop, these caterpillars have evolved over the millennia to mimic that, so that birds will pretty much not try to pay any attention to it at all. So I mentioned oaks before, and besides oaks, there are a host of other native species, and so these figures are pulled directly from the Doug Tallamy book, Bringing Nature Home. So some of these species, like blueberry, might not be as compatible with the Midwest here, but certainly native species as a whole provide much more of an ecological service to these birds. So at your home and on my visit to Prairie Crossing, there's a lot of oaks, there are willows, there are evergreens, there are native pine trees, birches, cherries. I saw all of those species. So you've got a very strong foundation, and needless to say, these trees that you've got in Prairie Crossing are attracting many, 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 many caterpillars. And just to give you a sense as to the staggering number of caterpillars, there was a study done on chickadees, and they found that from the time that the nestling hatches out of its egg to the time that it leaves the nests as a fledgling, they go through anywhere from 300 to 600 caterpillars per day, which equals about 9,000 caterpillars from the moment of attaching to the time that it's fledging. So if you multiply that by all the chickadees in North America, you're talking about staggering amounts of caterpillars. And that's just for chickadees. We're not talking about the hundreds of other bird species that rely on caterpillars for the main source of food for their young. And then just to illustrate one more time, the staggering difference, we're literally talking about a magnitude of 100 times that the oaks provide more caterpillars than ginkgos or other non-native species. And so it's not hyperbolic to say that a world without insects really is a world without birds. Without caterpillars for birds to feed their young, there would simply be a collapse of the food system for these birds, and they simply would not survive for very long. So we've talked about insects. Now let's talk about berries and fruits. I think one thing that I want to say about berries and fruits are that I think a lot of people have a misconception about berries and fruits, that all birds can eat berries. That is unfortunately not true. There are some species of shrubs like the spicebush here again, whose berries are small enough for something like a thrush or a warbler to eat. But many other species, wild cherries, are simply too big for a tiny bird to eat. So with fruits, you're really providing a benefit for some birds. But again, a lot of these native shrubs like spicebush support a rich array of caterpillars as well. Let's talk about some fruit producing native species that are great for the Chicago region. This species is the eastern wahoo, or Euonymus atropurpureus. And this just really has one of the most stunning color displays in late summer and early fall. They get these seed pods that burst open, these pink seed pods with these bright reddish orange fruits that the birds go crazy over. I've literally sat there and watched as birds fight over the last remaining fruits on these trees. You have to be careful when you purchase this, because there are several non-native varieties of Euonymus. Like burning bush is one of the most common ones that you find. It's probably one of the more common landscaping shrubs that you find in the region. It also produces bright, beautiful fruits like this. The stems look much different, but the difference between that species and this species and its usefulness for caterpillars and birds is there's a huge difference. Spicebush, again, I won't go into this too much other than saying that the native fruits are so beneficial to birds because of the high content of fats that you find in the fruits. And the spicebush berry is comprised of almost 50% fats. So when you're thinking about a bird migrating halfway across the globe, you can think of something like a buckthorn berry or a honeysuckle berry as something that is more akin to junk food, a bag of potato chips or something. And if you're about to run the longest marathon of your life, would you rather eat a bag of potato chips, or would you rather eat a bag of trail mix with nuts and grains and fruits that'll sustain you? That's really the difference that we're talking about. I don't mean to say necessarily that non-native species like buckthorn and honeysuckle don't feed birds. They do, but they simply do not sustain birds. And a lot of those non-native fruits like buckthorn and honeysuckle are actually diuretics, which aren't helpful to birds and which is responsible for their proliferation across the United States. A bird that eats a buckthorn berry within an hour has probably already pooped out the seeds and deposited it under the tree that it was standing on when it pooped. So you can really understand how quickly a lot of these non-native species have spread. Blackhaw Viburnum is another one of my favorites. Viburnums score really, really high in terms of their attractiveness to caterpillars, but it also does produce edible fruits that many bird species can eat. And I don't have a picture of the fall foliage, but it's really a stunning species. Serviceberry. This is one that has really grown in popularity. I found in the Chicago area. I see it really being used heavily in Chicago street plantings. There are some really high-profile trails, bike trails that have been built here in the Chicago area, not too far from where I live, and these serviceberries line the trail, and it's really awesome to see in the summer months, because as the name implies, with Juneberry, these are really early ripening fruits, and they're absolutely delicious. So I certainly am an advocate for planting native plants for the benefit of birds, but it also doesn't hurt to have something that you as a human being could also enjoy. And Juneberry or serviceberry pie is a real unheralded treat of the upper Midwest. The name serviceberry, just as a quick little aside, is named such because back in the early days, in the early settlement of the Midwest, this species was said to have its berries to have its bloom, its flowers start blooming right at around the time that you can start to continue offering funeral services. So when people were all buried and the holes were dug by hand, there's kind of like along with the folklore that once the serviceberries start blooming, you could start digging graves again. A little bit morbid, but thought it was interesting to share. So the third food group, nectar, and nectar is a food group that, similar to the fruits, will only appeal to a smaller subset of birds, but the impacts of the native species that provide nectar go beyond just nectar for birds. Obviously, so many interrelated relationships with insects. But nectar is really where we talk about hummingbirds. So hummingbirds, the ruby-throated hummingbird in our region is unfortunately the only species of hummingbird that we really see here. But it is a summer resident of the Chicago area. And as Jim mentioned earlier, this is a species, if you want to see hummingbirds in your yard, definitely plant red flowers, plant native red flowers. And you can see here on the Cardinal Flower that this hummingbird is pollinating. You see how long the tube of the flower is, so that the hummingbird can stick its beak and its very long tongue out, and it laps up the sweet nectar at the end of it. So for some species, fruits and caterpillars might sustain them on their migrations. For these hummingbirds, they have to find nectar sources all the way from Mexico all the way to the Chicago area. The cool thing about hummingbirds and their appetite for nectar is that, as humans, we're able to put up these hummingbird feeders, this sugar water, and that mimics the nectar source. But hummingbirds are really amazing creatures. And here's a wild columbine. This is a spring blooming plant that'll bloom in May and June. And this will also attract hummingbirds. And if you can imagine a hummingbird that has just arrived in the Chicago region after having flown across the Gulf of Mexico and on a nonstop flight, nectar sources early in the season, like that wild columbine provides, is in some cases the difference between life and death for these hummingbirds. And as Jim said, almost on cue, the royal catchfly. All the species I've shown, the Cardinal Flower, the jewelweed, I'll get more into jewelweed a little bit later, and the royal catchfly here. These are all species that the hummingbirds love. And you can see here, very long tube, nectar down at the base of that tube for the hummingbirds to exploit. And if you plant some of these in your yard, it's, again, not hyperbole to think that the hummingbirds that you see in your yard are the same ones that are returning year after year, which sounds really far-fetched, but there have been studies that have been shown. They've tagged hummingbirds with tiny little bands that can be identified with binoculars, or if the birds are caught in a mist net, they can be identified. There's a house in Ohio. There have been films and articles written about this guy in Ohio who's got hundreds and hundreds of hummingbird feeders in his yard, and they were able to do studies and found that a lot of the birds that returns to his yard year after year were the same birds, which is mind-boggling to think that a tiny bird that weighs as much as that hummingbird can go from Mexico to the same yard in Ohio or in Lake County every single year. Okay, the fourth food group, nuts and seeds. So nuts and seeds cover a huge range, but I think for nuts, we're talking predominantly larger species like blue jays are exploiting this. They're able to cache oak nuts or hickory nuts, and based on their forgetfulness, or thanks to their forgetfulness, lots of oak trees get planted over time. One of my favorite nut-producing trees is the hazelnut, which 100 or 150 years ago was probably the most common shrub in the state of Illinois. It's a species that can grow in prairies, it can grow in savannas, it can grow in sunny openings in the woods, and it produces a hazelnut. Or for some folks that grew up in the 50s, filbert was a very common name for this shrub. But for all generations of Americans, I think we all appreciate the hazelnut as the main ingredient in Nutella. So this amazing nut, it's highly prized by wildlife. So if you plant this in your yard, you will be competing with wildlife to harvest any hazelnuts that you're lucky enough to get your hands on. And seeds. Seeds are important, and I brought this photo up with the purple coneflower specifically to make a public service announcement to please implore people that are planting native plants in their yard to not deadhead plants until late in the winter, early in the spring, because for a species like this goldfinch, not deadheading eliminates a very important food source for a whole suite of birds that rely on them. And some of my favorite seed-producing native plants and shrubs is New Jersey tea. And New Jersey tea has a really interesting place in American history. I've read in many places that after the Boston Tea Party, when the Americans threw over crates of imported tea from Britain, this was one of the most common replacements that Americans were encouraging others to harvest for tea, for American tea. And this species is really one of the biggest magnets for pollinators that we have in our region. There are sites in Lake County, forest preserve sites that I've visited that have high populations of New Jersey tea, and it's always staggering to see the diversity of insects. I've counted over 20 species of insects on a single New Jersey tea at the same time before. So it's really, really a good one for the yard. Musclewood or blue beech, this is a great small tree / shrub, has very interesting bark, as you can see here, sinewy, almost resembling the musculature of a human arm or leg. This is a great one. Scores very highly for as a host plant for caterpillars. And asters, goldenrods. Goldenrods are a tricky one, which I'm not going to get too much into today because there's only a few species that I would recommend to plant in the yard. But asters, there are also some problematic asters that can be a little aggressive as well. But asters are another example of a species that provides food sources for insects late in the summer and early in the fall, but it also provides seeds in the winter for a lot of species. So that's why it's another reason why it's really important to not deadhead a lot of your plants over the winter. because there's species like white-throated sparrows. I'm sure that there are probably white-throated sparrows hopping somewhere around Prairie Crossing right now, exploiting eating all the seeds, taking advantage of all the seeds that are in your yards and in your prairies and in your common areas at Prairie Crossing. And so we've gone through the 4 major food groups for birds. And again, just to hammer home the importance of this, and the urgency that we're really dealing with, and why I would encourage you to plant more native plants, to talk to your neighbors about planting more native plants, is because of the effects of climate change, the effects that we're already starting to see. So this is one of my favorite bird species. If I were to say probably my favorite bird in the Chicago area, it's the bobolink. And this bird is one of our longest distance migrants that we have. It's a species that migrates all the way from Argentina and Uruguay, and it comes to the Chicago area. It arrives in May, and by August it's gone. It's here for a brief couple of months, and it's really important. And I feel a great sense of responsibility working with these birds in the prairies of the Chicago area, because they're only here for 3 months of the year, and it's the time of the year that they're trying to raise the next generation of bobolinks. And so anything I can do to make it easier on bobolinks, they already face enough pressures on their wintering grounds in Argentina. In Uruguay, you have to remember, as I keep hitting that button, I'm sorry, as you have to remember, as these species are going to South America, and during our winter, it is then summer in South America, and these birds are considered agricultural pests. So they are widely killed by farmers because bobolinks go really strong after rice crops in particular. And so the map that I'm showing you here is directly from Audubon's climate change report, which found that over half of all North American bird species are at threat of going to experience a threat of extinction over the next century due to climate change. And you can see that as this as the map goes, everything that you're seeing in red is parts of its current range that is projected to lose. And you see along the left, the warming scenarios. There are 3 scenarios for climate change that this model is looking at. And so it's going through a 1.5 degree, 2 degree, and 3 degree Celsius increase in annual temperatures. We're already probably past the 1.5 degree Celsius threshold, and if we reach the 3 degrees Celsius threshold, that in some ways is what scientists are calling like the doomsday scenario. So thankfully we're not there yet, but we really need to act quickly to make sure that we don't get there. And so what you're seeing is the range of the bobolink, and as it's expected to contract through the red color, and then you're also seeing that blue color is range that it's projected to gain. Now, this is a bird that nests predominantly in prairies, especially large prairies. In the Chicago area, we likely are not going to see this bird breeding in prairies that are smaller than 100 acres. Sometimes maybe prairie of 30 acres or so, it can carve out breeding success, but really we're talking about 100 acres or so. And as this bird, if climate change, as the climate warms, these birds might decide to start moving north to seek out those climatic conditions that it's comfortable with. The only problem is that when it gets into Canada, you're not looking at wide expanses of prairie like you're able to see in the upper Midwest and in the Great Plains. You hit the boreal forest. So if this bird decides that it can no longer survive here and it moves north, it's going to find no compatible habitat to live with. And birds are very adaptable creatures, but for a grassland prairie nesting bird, nesting in a boreal forest is simply not going to happen anytime soon. So there's a huge threat, and I hope it just underlines everything that I'm saying about why it's so important that we work to create a contiguous landscape of native plants in our communities so that these birds can, the common thinking is that a strong, diverse prairie or community like Prairie Crossing with many different native plant species is going to be more resilient to the effects of climate change, which might make it more hospitable to a lot of these birds. So what can we do? as homeowners, as residents of the region, to make a brighter future for birds. So one thing that we can do is to diversify the landscape. So this is what a lot of suburbia looks like. Walking around Prairie Crossing was really an eye-opening experience. Living in Chicago, where I get excited if I see one person planting a native plant in their yard, I was pleasantly surprised to see pawpaws and oaks and hazel and an assortment of native species. So you guys already have have a leg up on most of the other population of the United States, but there's obviously ways that you can improve that. And so when we're talking about providing resources for resident and migratory birds, we're talking about using native plants. And native plants are less resource intensive. They require fewer pesticides. They support pollinating insects, and they attract birds. That being said, it's not necessarily easier per se. I would encourage everyone who wants to plant native plants in their yard to embrace the learning aspect of native plants. I've never met someone who has an impressive native plant garden that hasn't gone through some frustration, that hasn't dug up a portion of their lawn at some point because they made the mistake in planting that really aggressive plant. Everyone makes mistakes. It's a learning process. There's small subtleties in the ways that our houses are structured and where shade falls and where on the house are your plants facing north? Is it a southern exposure? That will impact the success or failure of native plants that you plant in your yard. But it's important to maintain a positive attitude and to embrace the fact that it's a learning process. So when we're talking about making your yard more bird friendly, there's a couple of key considerations. You want to be able to not only provide a diversity of native plant species, but a diversity in structure. So Prairie Crossing being a prairie type of community, you might not have quite as many canopy trees or overstory trees, but there are, I did see some, and that is one level of the structure. There are some birds that will predominantly search for food in the upper reaches of the canopy, looking for insects that might be growing on small branches. Meanwhile, you have other species that are exploiting the mid-story, small trees and shrubs, like I was showing you with the musclewood. Other bird species might be relying predominantly on the mid-story for their food. Other birds are relying on the understory. So this is more like your perennials, your wildflowers, your grasses, your ground cover, and then the ground itself, leaf litter predominantly. Many birds over the winter, during the growing season, are foraging for food in the leaf litter. So along with my plea for you to limit your deadheading as much as possible, please don't rake your leaves. Please leave your leaves as much as possible, because 94% of moth caterpillars, which make up more of a diversity of caterpillars as a whole compared to butterflies, there are many more species of moths than there are caterpillars in the United States. 94% of these moth caterpillars pupate in the ground or in leaf litter. So, and in a community like Prairie Crossing that does have a lot of overlap with other conservation areas, with the Liberty Prairie, you likely are getting large amounts of moth caterpillars in your leaf litter in your community. So it's important to leave that for the birds to find next spring once these caterpillars have hatched out. And pesticide, goes without saying, a lot of native species don't require pesticide. There are some aggressive native species, but pesticide and herbicide is usually not the answer for keeping those in check. But obviously these are going to have repercussions. If insects are being impacted by pesticides, the birds that eat them will likely be impacted as well. And water. So water is something that I think goes unheralded in many people's minds as an important thing you could do for birds in your yard. Something as simple as a bird bath or a small little pond. If you have one, I'm sure you've seen birds, maybe like this eastern towhee, exploit that, because birds need to drink water too. and they need to clean off in the summer months. It helps keep them cool. So definitely, that's a very simple thing you can do to make your yard a little bit more bird friendly. And brush piles might not be the most popular thing in terms of aesthetic for many homeowners, but brush piles like these left over the winter can provide really important refuge for birds, especially birds as they're being stalked by predators. If there's, a lot of you mentioned red-tailed hawks in your earlier remarks, and a brush pile is a great place for a small bird like a chickadee or a vireo to hide in if predators are around. And there's a good way and a bad way to construct brush piles, but the basic gist of it is that you want to provide birds an opportunity to fly in from a lot of different angles for birds to get in and to get out. And then also the brush piles attract a good diversity of insects, and that will concentrate in the leaf litter directly under the brush pile, which a lot of birds will also take advantage of. And especially like birds like the dark-eyed junco, which is right now one of our winter resident birds. These are birds that are breeding in the boreal forests in the far northern reaches of the continent, and in the winter months they call the Chicago region home. So they definitely benefit from things like people not deadheading, people not raking leaves, and people constructing brush piles. Tree swallows, tree cavities are another important thing. Dead trees. I heard earlier in the remarks someone mentioned a dead tree. Not only are they important for woodpeckers who might be foraging for boring insects in dead wood, birds like tree swallows nest in cavities of trees. They also will nest in bird boxes, similar to the eastern bluebird, which many of you mentioned as well. The eastern bluebirds actually forage on the ground. They're not looking for insects in the wood. In prairie crossing, you're likely to find them in the prairie openings, foraging on the ground during the winter months, looking for insects to pull out of the ground. So I'm going to hit pause there to see if there are any questions. I'm almost at the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to check in with you, Nathan, to see if we needed to hit pause here for a second.
How much more do you have left, Daniel?
Just a few more slides. I'm just going to really talk about some of my recommendations for plants, and I'm going to be sharing, I'll send you a PDF of all of the slides so folks can digest the information at their own pace, but I will be kind of blowing through the rest of this and kind of just trying to get you excited about some of these plants.
Yeah, why don't you just wrap up, and then we'll just have a long question and answer session.
Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the native plant species that I think are great for people's yards. They're beautiful, they're interesting, they have great backstory to them, they're important for birds, they're important for insects. And blazing star, Liatris, there's many species of Liatris that are native to the Chicago region. All of them will attract butterflies, great diversity of butterflies. This is a very important nectar source for butterflies, monarch butterflies, as they're migrating southward in the fall. Cardinal flower, we already talked about cardinal flower and its importance for hummingbirds. And then bee balm and wild bergamot, one of our most prolific native species, blooms for very long periods over the summer months, attracts lots of insects. And here in this picture, you can see a moth, a hummingbird moth pollinating this bergamot. The yellow coneflower is another one that's very, very desirable for native insects. Finches and other small birds will actually eat the seeds when they're ripe. And this plant, when its seed is dried up and when it's crushed in your hands, is, in my opinion, the best smelling thing you can smell on the prairie. It's an intoxicating smell. Wild petunia is a great one because it's a very low growing plant. It can grow along borders. Similarly, very important for native insects, and it's beautiful. And the aesthetic of it, compared to the petunias that you'll find at Home Depot, just has a much more beautiful wild appearance, in my opinion. Blue-eyed grass. This is one for folks who maybe want a more orderly looking native plant garden. This plant only grows a few inches off the ground. it's actually a member of the iris family. It's not a grass as it implies, but when it's not blooming, it looks just basically like blades of grass, like a little patch of crabgrass in your lawn. Sky blue aster, I spoke a little bit about some of the asters, and I mentioned that some of them can be a little bit aggressive. Some of them are a little bit more on the weedy side, but sky blue aster is a stunning example of a native species that blooms in the fall. You know, this aster will bloom maybe as early as August and September, but you'll find blooms as late into October, November. So I think it's really important to in your native garden. One of the things that makes native plants so cool is that you can really plan your yard from blooming from as early as April and May all the way through October, November. Culver's root. This one is really one of the showier native plant species. Looks like an amazing white candelabra. And here in this picture, you can see it growing handsomely with Cardinal Flower. Ohio spiderwort is another one. This plant blooms for a very long period. Usually each plant, you can kind of see in these pictures, the flowers, each individual flowers last for probably only about a day, but each flower opens up on each plant on a different day. And so you get a really prolonged bloom period for this species. And it's a very highly prized food source for turtles. There was a study done on some prairies west of Chicago, and they found that the ornate box turtle, which is a very rare declining turtle species, would eat Ohio spiderwort. When they knew it, they knew that it was an important food source because, as you can see on the picture on the left, just below the flower, there's a small bud of a flower ready to bloom. It contains a ton of moisture, so the turtles will cut the plant down, eat the buds, and develop a big blue ring around their mouths. Prairie dropseed, I think, is one of the best grasses to plant in the garden at home. It's a grass that has interest across all 4 seasons, and it can grow. It looks a little bit more orderly than some of the other native grasses. It's a low growing plant, and it has a very interesting, intoxicating smell when it's in seed, like the picture on the left. Some people say that it smells like buttered popcorn. I've never quite smelled it that way, but it definitely has a distinctive smell. And the milkweeds. So the milkweeds are super, super, super important, not only for insects, but as we know, the monarch butterflies. And there are many native species that we have. These are just 3 of them. These are 3 that are probably the most commonly found. The common milkweed, the butterfly milkweed, and the swamp milkweed. As the name implies, all slightly accustomed to different levels of water and moisture in the soil. So it's important to vet that a little bit. And just beware of nativars. So I think many good intentioned people are trying to perfect native plants a bit by through plant breeding. As with any plant, you can breed plants to exhibit certain characteristics. So if you want the flower to be bigger, if you want the leaves to be smaller, if you want the shape of the flower to be different or the color of the flower to be different, these are all things that plant breeders can and do. But when you're talking about the very unique relationships that insects have with native species, changing something like the shape or the color of a flower could have disastrous impacts on them. So the easiest way to tell nativars is they usually have a patented name after them. So you can see here on the left, we have Aquilegia canadensis pink lanterns. And when you see something in quotes at the end of the name of a scientific name, that's generally a sign that it is a species that has been bred for certain characteristics. Similarly, right beneath it, Asclepias incarnata. This is swamp milkweed. This is called ice ballet milkweed. The normal Asclepias, I'm going to go back to my last slide, is a pink flower. You can see that on the right. By changing that flower to white, it might make itself unknown to a whole set of insects. And so it's really important that both of the species on the right, you can see Asclepias incarnata, Asclepias syriaca, they don't have those patented designer names attached to them, and that's usually a better sign that they're not going to be manipulated in any way. So a couple last slides that I have, I just want to turn you on to a very useful tool because I know that planting native plants is not easy. There's not many great resources. Everyone, if we could match every homeowner with a native plant mentor, if we could clone Jim 100 times and have him visiting each one of your yards every day and helping you in your gardens, you guys would all do a great job. But fortunately, our cloning technology is not that great yet, so we can't do that. So Audubon has developed this native plant database that you can search for species of native plants suitable to your region just by simply putting in your zip code. I'm just as frustrated by the amount of emails that I get as you are. So you can also put in just your zip code without your email address if you don't want to start getting Audubon emails. And it'll take you, once you put in your zip code, it'll take you to this page with different results of different native species. You can add them to a plant list that you start generating. You can see here there's a add to your plant list. You could see some of the bird species that might be attracted to your yard. You can search by specific species if you want annuals or if you want trees in particular. You could also search by plant resources. So if you want to get the best caterpillar plants, you can search just for caterpillars. If you want nectar plants for hummingbirds, you can search just for those. And you could also search by birds. It'll give you specific search results based on species that will likely be useful to these species. And it'll also give you local resources. So it'll connect you to local Audubon chapters who can help direct you. It can help direct you to native plant societies locally. Here we have a really good native plant society in Illinois. It'll also show you where you can buy native plants near you, garden centers and nurseries, and then also online native plant retailers. And like I said, I'm going to share all of this later, so you don't have to worry about jotting down this link here, but the Illinois Native Plant Society website has a really good list of native plant sales that they update every year and native plant nurseries. And so I'm not going to go over this because these are things that we've already touched on, all the reasons why our yards are beneficial. You'll see in this a couple of ideas for ways that you might be able to plan your backyard. For someone like me, I'm the type of person who just gets out there and figures it out. Other people like to plan things out far in advance. And I urge you again, if you're taking on native plants for the first time, do things in phases. Please do not attempt to radically transform your entire yard in a single year. You're going to get discouraged when you have to start weeding, and you're going to say, I thought native plants were supposed to be maintenance free. But when you radically transform a yard that quickly, you're likely to come across some difficulties. So do it in phases. I like this one. There are some native plants gardens that mimic more of like a wild aesthetic, and others that are more orderly. This was an example that I pulled from Eastern Illinois. It has a great prairie native plant resources, and these were some ideas that they provided for native plant gardening planning. So I would definitely encourage you to do some planning because you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. And so just as a quick example for like the more orderly species by species composition of native plant gardens, but then also more of this like wild aesthetic. There's no shortage of ways that you could plan. And I certainly am not the type of person who looks down my nose at other people who want to plant a lily in their yard, or they want to plant some other non-native species. I'm not a purist in that sense, but I believe it's important that we plant native species. I hope that you've seen the benefits that these native species provide, but certainly this is a journey. You're not going to get there all in one growing season. Take small bite-sized chunks of your yard, see what species you like, see which ones you don't. You can always dig them up. You can always replace them. Think of it as a lifelong learning opportunity. And as I mentioned before, bird friendly is climate friendly. We're building more resilient habitats for these species. Just a couple more slides, Nathan, I promise. Oaks are a very, very important tool against climate change. Oaks are some of our longest lasting trees in the United States, and in our region, some of our oldest oak trees are on the order of 300 years old. Oak trees are unique because as they grow older, they're able to sequester more and more carbon. So after about 50 years, an oak tree like this, once it's grown for 50 years, it has sequestered about 45,000 tons of carbon in its plant, in its bark and in its branches. And after 75 years, that number almost doubles. So planting oaks is an investment in your future, in your children's future, in your grandchildren and great-grandchildren's future. And the last thing I just wanted to kind of mention is prairie crossing. It was mentioned before. You're part of a 6,000 acre complex of land that is relatively undeveloped when compared to a lot of the rest of the region. And you really have this unique opportunity in your backyard to connect to this larger complex and really, really, really make a difference for birds. I live in Chicago, and on my tiny little property, even though I do have native plants planted, I don't think I'm going to be saving the entire population of cerulean warblers just by my own backyard. But in your prairie crossing community, you really do have the opportunity to help out countless numbers of breeding and migratory birds in your own backyard. So I hope you really realize how lucky you are to live in a place like this, because the impacts that you have on native species, for native plants and for animals, is really, it's really, really, really a huge impact that you're making. These are a couple apps that I would just recommend if you're looking for resources on how to identify the birds that are coming to your yard. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology has this app Merlin, where you can go through a series of very simple questions, and it has a pretty good way of accurately spitting out the bird that you're likely seeing. And iNaturalist and Seek, which is product of iNaturalist, are also really good ones to play around with. So that's the information that I said before. And I finally got there, Nathan, about 20 minutes after I told you I would. But thank you all so much for your questions and for your attention. Really, really pleased to be able to share this with you today.
Daniel, this has been fantastic. Everyone, if you want to unmute your audio and video so we can see everybody's reaction. Daniel, you put a lot of great information all together in a really compelling way. Thank you so much for that. We did actually, in fact, I know for some people this might be late. If you have to leave, we certainly understand. There will be a video recording of this that we will share. I wanted to make sure that I read a message from Suzanne, who had to leave. She said, I have to leave, but this has been really terrific. Daniel is a great speaker and the information is very helpful. Thanks for setting up. So kudos to you, Daniel, for a great presentation. Mm-hmm. I have some questions. I would love to, but I want to throw it out to other people to either through the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I can call on you, whatever you'd like to do. All right, I'm gonna go with Mark. Mark first.
Yeah, quick question about bird feeders. You really said nothing about the good old traditional bird feeders and good or bad, and if you do use, I use one. For example, I mentioned at the outset, that red-bellied woodpecker, one of my favorites. Well, he's a frequent visitor to a suet cake that I put out there, but is long run, is it a good idea, bad idea, or what?
No, bird feeders, I would say, are always a great idea, and I would think of them as an added benefit to native plants. Certainly, if at the very least you could put up a bird feeder it makes a difference. The limitations of bird feeders is that not all birds will visit them, not all species. So certainly other species will get will get the advantages, while other species, like for instance, some of the ones that are really longer distance migrants, like the warblers and such, usually are not found at bird feeders because the resident birds that know the bird feeders, that are used to it, bully them away from them. So I would say, bird feeders are great. I would encourage you to continue doing that. They undoubtedly make a difference. And I would just challenge you to also augment that with native species so that you get a larger diversity of birds that you're able to impact with that.
Awesome. Linda, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. It seems to me that this year I have fewer species and a smaller number of birds in my yard at my feeders. Could that be true? And if so, what would cause it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you know, it's hard to say with any specificity why that change. You know, I don't doubt that you did see less birds this year, and it could be for many different reasons. So like, I couldn't get into the intricacies of migration so much, but there are certainly many factors that contribute to when birds migrate and where they're migrating. And things like major storm systems are things that can knock birds off course. In a given year, there have been studies that show that some species that usually migrate through the Great Plains, through places like Nebraska and eastern Colorado and Kansas, with major storms, with tornadoes, get redirected sometimes as far away as hundreds of miles. That doesn't necessarily answer your question, but one thing that we've seen, like in other parts of the country, for instance, this year with like with the awful in 2020 with the wildfire season that was seen out west, there were lots of birds were totally, their migrations were totally screwed up. The timing of that was screwed up. Their food sources were non-existent, so they had to go farther and farther than they ever have. So there's a range of factors. I can't say for sure what caused a smaller number of birds in your particular yard, but you know, there are you know, at some points catastrophic events that impact populations of species that might not be well understood here in places where they're migrating through, but are attributed to places either on their breeding grounds or on their wintering grounds. So usually over time, even when you see like big fluctuations of birds, over time the trends tend to level out, and some years you might get an especially active year. So I wouldn't try to go too far into the rabbit hole and think that something terrible has happened. Things will likely rebound. There's too many variables to say why, though.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't be more specific.
That's okay.
Anybody else? Oh, my wife, go ahead, maybe.
Okay, a great presentation. I totally loved it. My question is, I was reading something last summer when I was preparing for a pediatric summer farming garden camp, and I had a segment on birds, and so they said that you could put like lint and 3-inch pieces of string or even hair into like suet cages so that in the spring they can build nests. So I've actually had Nathan cut my hair in 3-inch portions, and I've been saving it as well as my dryer lint. Is that true? I mean, would you recommend that so that they don't have to spend so much energy?
I would say I would encourage to use natural materials first and foremost. Birds are amazing builders, and birds will make use of anything that is around. I've seen birds with nests with floss in them, with streamers from a balloon. They'll use anything. Some birds will use a lot of birds, especially like for one that you guys see at Prairie Crossing a lot, the eastern bluebird. That species co-evolved with bison, and so they used to follow the herds of bison, and bison fur was the predominant thing that they would use in their nest. Well, for the eastern bluebirds, not so much because they're cavity nesters, but for a species, for other bird species that follow the bison herds, bison hair was the predominant material that they would use. Now, in kind of the developed landscape that we live in, they'll use pretty much anything. But spider webs are another one. Like the blue-gray gnatcatcher will use spider webs and will pick off lichens off of the barks of trees. And if you've ever seen a blue-gray gnatcatcher nest, it's like the most like stunning piece of architecture you've ever seen, and it can fit in the palm of your hand. So I would say, you know, certainly natural materials. So things like I don't know, I can't. I'm not thinking on my feet right now, but you know,
So hair is
things,
okay?
things like, yeah, things. So the issue with things like non-natural materials is that sometimes as birds fledge their nests, they might, if it's things that birds normally don't build their nests with, fledglings have been known to get caught up in these materials in the nest. They can't get out, they die. So it's important to try to give them as natural types of things that they're used to. But human hair would certainly be one of those for sure.
Well, they said, you know, not to cut it any longer than 3 inches because they could get tangled. So I've been trying to keep it less than 3 inches.
Yeah, I think that's good.
I think
And I see Bonnie maybe raising her hand. I think you want to talk.
So every year, especially in the spring, I take the cats out and I furminate them. Hair all over the yard. I mean, spread all over the yard. Mark's like, clean it up. You're ridiculous. I said, give me 20 minutes. They swoop down, pick up all the cat hair. My yard is totally clean. And I've actually found a fallen nest from a tree. I have a white cat and Nellie right here. He's darker. And found a nest with all my cat's fur in it. It's amazing.
Excellent.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I have a question, Daniel. So many of us have smaller yards. Prairie Crossing was designed to have small yards with lots of big open space. So if you have a small yard, is it better to plant a few species in a lot of numbers that birds can easily find? Or is it better to plant a whole bunch of variety, but only a few species of each, or a few of each?
I think you could be successful either way. I would say if you're just getting started, I would start with a few species. Different species, it depends on your aesthetic choice, right? I would say the main thing that I would encourage people to do is to augment any wildflowers that they're planting with a shrub, even if it's just one shrub. That is really the missing component in a lot of native gardens, that shrub. And as I mentioned, you know, caterpillars being such an important food source, trees and shrubs are really important. The wildflowers, not so much in terms of caterpillar production. So I would say if you're new to it, start with a few native species, start with things that you like looking at, and then build from there. I've seen people with very small parcels have very diverse, you know, some of the most diverse prairies in Illinois are these small 1 acre parcels that are barely hanging on. And you might not be able to create quite that level of diversity in your yard. But certainly I would say the more you play with it and let your yard develop organically over time and add things as you go, you can build a pretty organic looking diverse yard.
Excellent. Anyone else have some questions? I have a few. Yeah, Jim.
Yes, Daniel, I should have been paying better attention. Are you going to clone me or clone me? I wasn't quite sure which. My wife says either one would be dangerous. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation, and hopefully we're preaching to the choir, because I'm saying this for a lot of reasons. One, you've done an excellent presentation, but two, you're repeating a lot of things I've been preaching for a long time, and that's always good.
Yeah.
And I need to hear things at least 10 times before it sinks into my brain. So hopefully.
Well, you're far advanced from me. 20 is the minimum.
Excellent. Any other questions?
I have one comment about dryer lint, because so much of our clothes now is, you know, all the phony fur stuff, and it's hard to just get a pure cotton lint or wool lint, and it's also, I think, becoming a problem in our lakes and stuff, all this little microplastic. So it's just, you know, something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
If Naomi would let us all take little clippings, that would be
hair, you mean?
Material there.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have, she would be looking a little bit short there.
Watch it now. Watch it now. No short jokes.
Okay. So I actually have a question, Daniel. First of all, I want to say I'm kind of glad that the art career didn't work out, so that you could be in the bird conservation world. That sounds kind of selfish. I'm sorry for that. But was there a particular moment or revelation when you said, you know what, I'm going to turn my life direction towards conservation and birds rather than doing something else?
Yeah, so I would say, so it's actually kind of funny, and I guess I realized in these situations I guess I could make up any story to make myself seem really cool in this situation. You wouldn't know if I was lying or not. But like I said, I grew up in Chicago. I was not, the type to go camping. That wasn't something I did. And when I was bagging groceries at Whole Foods with my college degree, just wondering the financial crisis was raging. I graduated college in 2010. Things were looking pretty grim, and I just thought to myself, what would if I could do anything, what would my dream job be? And I think after having I went to college in New York City, and then having moved back to Chicago, where I'm originally from, I was just like, something outside of a city. I said National Park Ranger, never having been to a national park in my life, except to go swimming at the Indiana Dunes. And so I decided I was going to start volunteering at the Indiana Dunes. And so I bought the cheapest used car that could reliably get me to the Indiana Dunes. And I started going out there twice a week on my days off. And they needed all the help that they could get. So they were eager to kind of direct me to places where I could help. And this was in kind of the springtime. And so I remember specifically going down the Coles Bog Trail at the Indiana Dunes, which is one of the most beautiful hikes that, I do it multiple times every year. It takes you through a beautiful swamp-like fen. It's a fen. It's a specific type of wetland that's not a swamp, but it, for all intents and purposes, looks like a swamp. And leads you through the sand dunes, which in July are blooming in an uninterrupted sea of orange from butterfly weed, the butterfly milkweed. And then getting a pair of binoculars and starting to see some of these tiny warblers and being like, what is that red thing flying around? I've never seen anything like that. What is that brightly colored yellow thing? I think that to me, just that was like an awakening. I realized that, driving by forest preserves all the time, the wall of buckthorn and honeysuckle that you see, I thought that's what Illinois nature looked like. And once I saw what the natural heritage of Illinois and what things are supposed to look like, that to me was like, it totally blew my mind, totally radicalized my thinking on nature and my relation to it. So I would say that the Coles Bog Trail at the Indiana Dunes, if any of you have never done it before, put it on your list. And the cool part about it is that you climb up these big sand dunes as you get closer and closer to Lake Michigan. And then there's this one giant sand dune you have to climb over at the very end before you can get to Lake Michigan. And usually you're the only person that you can see in any direction, and you've got all of Lake Michigan to swim in yourself. And it's much cleaner than the lakes that I swim in, the beaches that I swim in Chicago on Lake Michigan. So couldn't recommend it more.
Excellent. That's a wonderful story.
Thank you. Thank you.
So anyone else? We're at almost 9 o'clock. This has been wonderful. I hope it's been good for everyone else. I'm going to try to end with one perhaps semi-funny question. Just as part of your research, you were talking about how important caterpillars are for bird nutrition. For research purposes, have you ever tried to eat a caterpillar?
No, I've never tried to eat a caterpillar because all the cool ones are designed to look like they'll kill you if you eat them. So if once you're off this call, if you have the chance to look at the caterpillar of the great Cecropia moth, the Cecropia moth caterpillar, and maybe it's simple enough that I could just pull it up here and show you. This to me is the most beautiful caterpillar I've ever seen. I saw it at Illinois Beach State Park once, and I'm going to share my screen here so you can see it. It is, I couldn't believe I stumbled upon this moss. There it is. This brightly colored yellow, orange, green, blue, red, and it's covered in spikes. And so it was about 4 inches long also. So that would have been a pretty sizable meal. So I passed. I've tried other insects before, but never caterpillars.
Excellent. So my last question to everyone else is, are you going to do anything different with your yard this year? I'm just curious because I've gotten excited about planting a few more things based on hearing this. All right.
I've already quit raking leaves.
Excellent.
This fall, for the first year.
That's a good start.
That sort of became kind of, I don't know why, just this year, that became a real trend, I think, in communication amongst people. And for whatever reason, a lot of people picked up on that this year.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, as a condo dweller with no yard, I'm only going to put red native plants in my window boxes. So
that's okay.
I did
have a number of hummingbirds at my flower boxes last year, and they definitely preferred the red flowers. So I'm going for that this year.
Excellent.
Awesome. And I would just add, I have lots of friends in Chicago that live in high rises that plant milkweed in pots on their balconies, and people as high as the 50th floor of buildings get monarch butterflies up there. So you'd be surprised. These animals know how to find their host plants.
Robert, we plant the milkweed. I have a summer place over in Saugatuck, Michigan, and we have milkweed all over the dune and lots of monarchs there. So that's fun to watch.
Robert, you were going to say something?
Nathan and Betsy, I've got a big yard, so you guys are welcome to come over and start planting prairie plants. All
right. I would love to do that. So, all right. Well, again, on behalf of all of us, Daniel, thank you so much for the energy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Awesome.
Very good.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan.
Have a great evening.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.